Okay, awesome. Welcome everyone to our panel, which is entitled The Colonial Development Experiment Nexus and its Gender, Race, and Class Impacts in the Caribbean. I'm so happy to have with me today these brilliant Caribbean Black women. First off, I want to introduce to you Dr. Tami Navarro, who's the Associate Director of Barnard Center for Research on Women. Dr. Navarro is the editor also of the Journal Scholar and Feminist Online. She holds a PhD in cultural anthropology from Duke University and has held positions at Rutgers University, Columbia University, and Wesleyan University. Her research has been supported by the Mellon Foundation, the Wiener Gren Foundation, the Social Science Research Council, the American Anthropological Association, the Ford Foundation. I tell you, these women are amazing. She has published work in cultural anthropology, American Anthropologist, Transforming Anthropology, Small Axe Salon, The Caribbean Writer, Social Text, The Global South. She serves on the board of the St. Croix Foundation and is a member of the editorial board of the journal Small Axe, a Caribbean journal of criticism. Tami is also the co-host of the podcast Writing Home, American Voices from the Caribbean, which is amazing. I listened a few months ago to the conversation with Alexis Pauline Gumbs. And she's currently completing a manuscript entitled Virgin Capital, Neoliberal Development in the US Virgin Islands, to be published by the State University of New York Press. I would also like to introduce to you Dr. Halimah Deshong, who has been a longtime friend and colleague. She is currently the Deputy Permanent Representative of the Permanent Mission of St. Vincent and the Grenadines to the United Nations, where she's on secondment from her post as the head of the Institute of Gender and Development Studies Nita Barrow Unit, which is my alma mater. At UE Cave Hill, she is an experienced feminist researcher. She specializes in gender and gender-based violence, feminist methodologies, anti and decolonial feminisms, qualitative interviewing. I tell you, these women bad, and the analysis of talk and text. She is the co-editor with Professor Kamala Kempadu of Methodologies in Caribbean Research on Gender and Sexuality, fresh off the press, and is currently completing another book-length manuscript on violence, the coloniality of gender and change. Her scholarly work is published in a wide range of peer-reviewed academic journals and books. She is a joint editor of 4 special issues of Feminist Methodologies, Men and Masculinities, and Gender, Sexuality, and Feminisms in the Caribbean. Halimah has advised Caribbean governments on gender-based violence, policies, and laws in Halimah has advised Caribbean governments on gender-based violence policies and laws, is the author of the St. Vincent and the Grenadines National Gender-Based Violence Action Plan, and has jointly designed a gender-based violence, health, and family life education curriculum for post-secondary school students in St. Vincent and the Grenadines with Dr. Tanya Haynes. She was also the lead researcher and author of the qualitative component of the UN Women CARICOM Caribbean Development Bank Women's Health Survey on Violence Against Women in Grenada. At present, she's the St. Vincent and the Grenadines expert on the United Nations Security Council on Women, Peace and Security, Children and Armed Conflict, Youth, Peace and Security, the protection of civilians, as well as the situations in Mali, Somalia, Guinea-Bissau, and West Africa, and Sahel. Animating her research, public service, scholarship, and outreach is a concern for ending the enduring effects of complex systems of violence. Man, y'all, let me tell you, these are some amazing women that you're about to listen to. And so I want to start off this panel. It's a conversational style panel. And so the panel is going to run, the panelists will have between 5 to 10 minutes to give a presentation. Then we will engage in a discussion, and then we'll open up for the audience for question and answer. So Tami and Halimah, and Tami, I want you to go first. I want you to tell me a little bit about your research. How has your research engaged the colonial heritage and the resulting gender, race, and class landscape, which developed in the Caribbean as a result of the impacts of coloniality? And how have you been able to talk a little bit about how we've been able to put this research into practice to foster development in the Caribbean spaces, particularly around issues related to gender, class, and race.
Thank you so much for that wonderful introduction, the inclusion in this exciting conference. I am just thrilled to be part of this esteemed panel, and I really look forward to the conversation. So yeah, I'm happy to talk a bit about my research, and I've put together a very brief kind of survey that kind of contextualizes the work I do. So I'm a cultural anthropologist by training. I'm from the island of St. Croix. And the work that I have been engaged in for about the last 10 years is looking at an offshore banking program, which I've come to theorize as a sort of neoliberal development program that's operating in the USVI. And my main kind of struggle was trying to theorize how did a program that seems to be, for its advocates, so new, right? This kind of neoliberal offshore banking, how is it experienced by people in the Virgin Islands as very old? So people talk about it as being slavery reincarnate or an instance of colonialism. So these two kinds of positions are very much at odds, right? Thinking about offshore banking, neither as new nor as extremely old, but trying to sort of make sense of the underpinnings, exactly what you were talking about, Andrea, and I'll get to this in my PowerPoint. But what are the underpinnings that make development initiatives possible, right? That make contemporary development initiatives possible? What are the ground upon which they're built? Because we know that nothing is ever just arising from the ether, right? So what are the kinds of assumptions, historical inequities, hierarchies, right? What is the ground upon which these things come to be? So that is, I'm gonna be brave and share my screen. Let me see, make sure I can manage it. Hold on. It went well in the run through, so give me one moment. Share. Oh no, it's not doing it. It did it so well in the run through. Okay.
Oh, there you go.
Oh, here we go. Okay. Good. All right. From the beginning. Okay, good. There we are. Right. So what I wanted to do is just give a really quick overview, and more will happen in the conversation, but on how this program came to be. Okay, so the program that I study is called the Economic Development Commission, or EDC program in the USVI. And it's a pretty standard tax holiday program that you will see in places like the Cayman Islands or the neighboring British Virgin Islands. But here it's a US territory, which is key to the operation of the program, right? So mainland Americans have been invited to come down to run their financial management companies, hedge funds in this American territory in the US Virgin Islands. In exchange for these very generous tax holiday benefits, which include 90% income tax forgiveness and all kinds of goodies really around things like property tax, right? So it's a very generous economic program. And what is the Virgin Islands meant to get in exchange? Well, they're supposed to stimulate the local economy by hiring local workers, donating to charitable causes, right? Really spread their kind of global wealth around. So it's a trickle down kind of model of how it's going to benefit the Virgin Islands and Virgin Islanders. So I'll talk more about that, the program in the conversation, but I really want to lay the groundwork for how something like this comes to make sense. What makes you, get together as the local and federal governments of the United States and think, okay, the way forward for these colonial possessions, because the USVI remains a territory, like Puerto Rico, an unincorporated territory of the US today, what makes you get together and think the way forward is to bring down financial management, right? And so I want to talk about the kind of historicizing that needs to happen in order to understand that logic and its contemporary operation. It keeps ticking like this. Okay, next. So I'll just start. There's a long history that goes back to plantation agriculture and notions about femininity and women's place and the work of Black bodies. All of that I talk about in my book. I have 5 minutes here, so I just chose a starting point that I think will give enough context, which is the 1950s, and this moment of the industrialization by invitation in the Caribbean. So we see this beginning in earnest in the 1950s, after the Cuban Revolution in '59 and the closing of Cuba to tourists. Tourism has to go elsewhere, so it sort of balloons, and we see people trying to sort of make space for these increasing visitors, and also kind of develop their islands, right? So we had a lot of rural agricultural economies before this period. So as we get more tourism growing, the tourism sector is growing, so hotels are being built, things like carnivals are being instituted and expanded, right? So that they're amenable to tourists, but we also have the deepening and development of an industrialization sector. And probably the big, if you know anything about this moment, the one you probably know about is the Puerto Rican instance of Operation Bootstrap, which is kind of the really sort of model of this moment, right? So we have pharmaceutical companies in particular being courted to come to Puerto Rico to operate in a really similar model to what's happening with the EDC in exchange for these kinds of tax holiday policies, right? So come down, make your products here. Again, it's quasi-American. So we see a trade-off. We see both the ostensible development of the Puerto Rico economy, which I'll talk about why I say ostensible, and also, right, that these companies get the kinds of economic benefits that they continue to reap through projects like the EDC. Let me see, keep doing that. Okay. I don't know if you all can hear, but every time I click next, it gives me a loud ticking. Okay, so Operation Bootstrap, as I talked about, it gives tax incentives to these companies. However, it decimated the agricultural sector. So as often happened with these kind of industrialization programs, these companies come down and people flock toward employment and encouraged structurally to encourage for employment, at the same time emptying out traditional sources of economic well-being for, you know, if we're just talking about Puerto Rico, agriculture, handicrafts, right, that these then become emptied out. And we see a mass exodus, as we continue to see in Puerto Rico, of people leaving the island. So unemployment actually balloons because these industries can only hold so many, right? Within one sector, you can only hold so many employees. So with the decimation and the government turning away from supporting traditional industries, unemployment goes through the roof. The wages at these companies are not particularly high at all because they negotiate these very favorable agreements with governments, with the Puerto Rican government. I see a similar thing with the Virgin Islands. And so I talk about this moment, this kind of industrialization moment, as a precursor to what we really have seen later down the line, which is these export processing zones, which is really the formalization of this notion of these special zones, right? So that these are where things are made. We see them, I'm thinking particularly in Jamaica, but technically they're not made in Jamaica, they're made in the export processing zone. So they are not subject to things like tariffs or things like laws. So minimum wage, things around insurance protections, unemployment protections don't apply. So really the kind of carving out of economic spaces of difference within the Caribbean, which I argue are really rooted in this kind of historical differentiation of the Caribbean. It's a sort of space of exception, of exploration, right? Let's try something out here. And here I'm looking at it in this sort of realm of the economic. So I'm gonna pick it up a little bit. So that's industrialization. We see this continuing and really deepening in the 1960s throughout Latin America and the Caribbean. So in the 60s, we have the Maquiladora program in Mexico. And here's really where I'm shifting my focus to think about the introduction of gender into the analysis. So these industrialization programs have to hire local workers. Yes, who do they hire? Overwhelmingly young women. And there's a kind of logic behind that that we can talk about. But yeah, when you look at the numbers, they really do court young women as sort of ideal employees that will make these factories run, turn up for work, right? Based on assumptions that they have families to support, that they can be paid less because they're again, these are assumptions, but that their income is not the primary, that they're not the primary breadwinners for their houses, for their households, rather that they're supplementary income. For those of us who work in the Caribbean, we know that's historically and in a contemporary sense inaccurate, right? But again, this is the kind of logic that undergirds these programs and their courting of women's labor. Yeah, so women's labor becomes devalued, underpaid, invisibilized. At the same time, they are the ones hired to perform these tasks, which are then, again, themselves devalued as menial, right? So if we're thinking about factory work, I talked about Puerto Rico with pharmaceuticals, but the Maquiladora program, this is where subsidiaries would come down and maybe if women are doing piecework, so they're sewing on maybe the hem of a garment, the sleeve of a t-shirt, right? And again, this work becomes devalued, the logic being, well, anyone could do that, right? It isn't hard work, why should it be paid well? And again, this naturalization of women's work, the feminization of labor, well, this is what they're good at anyway, right? Women are good at sewing, women are good at, they have nimble fingers. This is all in air quotes, all very problematic, but the kind of gendered logic and underpinnings that begin to make their way into job opportunities and how people are able to earn livings and support their households. Just move a little Right, so I hope you can see this picture. I talked a bit about the maquiladora context in Mexico. So here we see young women at work. Oh, go back. No. Here we see young women at work in such an industry, right? Sewing on, doing, again, this piecework. And here I want to just draw the connection to what I'm talking about with these EDC girls. So the women that are hired in the Economic Development Commission program that I talked about at the outset, which is the focus of my own work, I really see a straight line between the feminization of labor in an earlier moment of industrialization, 50s, 60s onward, and the kind of contemporary work that these women are doing in offices, right? Answering telephones, making coffee, being administrative support to things like day traders and hedge fund managers in the US Virgin Islands. And we see this across the region. In Barbados, Carla Freeman has worked on the informatics sector, which is very similar, not exactly the same. There's some important differences, but for the purposes of this talk, just thinking through how gender informs hiring, right? That it's young women that are hired for this particular kind of work. In her instance, she's looking at data entry. Mine is a little different. It's finance management. But again, just thinking about the long history of feminized labor, Black women's labor, and how they come to be seen as desirable employees and why that might be in the contemporary moment. Again, thinking through not the newness or the kind of historical continuities of this program, but kind of what is the midpoint, right? So not that it is necessarily the same as plantation agricultural colonialism, but that some of the kind of expectations, hierarchies, and histories continue to inform hiring today. So again, just to complicate a notion that it is this entirely contemporary phenomenon. I talked about some of the problems with industrial development. We see here the continued, often increased reliance on foreign capital, right? So again, the gutting of these local industries as these pharmaceutical companies come in, they have more decision-making power, they have more economic power, right? Over and against any kind of local grassroots community control. We see the spike in unemployment, as I talked about in Puerto Rico, up above 20%. We see displacement, really the sort of decimating of these island populations. People have to leave, which is facilitated by their Americanness, right? So the position of coloniality makes it possible for Puerto Ricans and US Virgin Islanders to move to places like New York and to begin these communities of Nuyorican, right? So often these communities are celebrated as kind of hybrid diasporic spaces, but really what are the economic push and pull factors that lead people to leave their home spaces and to begin communities elsewhere? I know I must be coming up on time, so I will just skip the 70s and just say that, yeah, the EDC program, for my thinking, is really a sort of moment of neoliberal development in which the market is centered, right? So away from making things, like away from the women of the maquiladora context. It's this notion that everything is going to be virtual, in the same way that we're meeting on Zoom now, and the labor that everyone at Virginia Tech has put in could be invisibilized, right? We log on to Zoom, there's a conference, right? But those of us who do this administrative labor know that there are weeks of work, and there's a whole host of tasks that then can easily become invisibilized by the sort of ease of the virtual. In the same way, the kind of virtuality of things like offshore banking and trading can invisibilize much labor, right? The kind of day-to-day operations that are necessary. Someone has to be there to turn on the lights, to answer the phones, to make sure these reports are filed. The kind of invisibilization of this labor goes alongside the feminization of labor more broadly. And so this is the kind of neoliberal model, the centering of the market rather than the state having any kind of decision-making power around hiring or even what these industries are going to do once they get on the ground, that I argue is happening in the EDC. Yeah, and quickly, just perhaps more to your point of the question, Andrea, how does this all affect women? Well, they're both negative. So if we think about structural adjustment policies, again, I skipped the slide on the 80s, but even thinking back to the 80s in places like Jamaica, we have the IMF stepping in. It's women that generally are responsible for heading these households, not exclusively, but quite often when we look at, for those of us who do cultural work and thinking about the rise in informal economies, right? As currencies are devalued, as informal economies rise, as women have to figure out how to juggle childcare, how to rely on kinship networks to make their lives possible so they can go to work in these export processing zones. That puts additional burden on their life. But it can also be read, and it often is in economic reports, as positive, right? That it's women that are hired to do these work, these kinds of work, if we look back at think back to the slide, it's women in these factories sewing. So it's true that women's employment has historically gone up with the introduction of these kinds of industrial programs, even with the EDC as I work in. But then we just want to question what is the quality of this work? What is the compensation of this work? What makes this work possible, and why women? Why young women in particular? Yeah, and so the last thing I'll say, I hope I'm not over 10 minutes, but the last thing I'll say is just that my focus is on the EDC program as a whole, but I'm really interested in the young women. And as I've talked about in this little overview, I'm really interested in historicizing the women at work in this sector, right? So I talked about Carla Freeman on pink collar workers, but I'm interested in these women who are generally in their 20s and 30s that populate this sector, right? That are these girls, they're called EDC girls on St. Croix, that answer the phones, that make life possible. They are the front door greeters, the front desk greeters at these companies. I'm really interested in theorizing their positioning, how they came to be employed in this sector, and what happens to their lives once they begin working in the EDC. So I'm happy to say more about that in the conversation, but I just wanted to kind of do a little bit of groundwork to say how a program like this came to be in an American territory. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Tami. That was an amazing presentation, and we'll get to that, our discussion in the discussion portion. I want to invite Halimah to present to us now.
Thank you very much, Andrea. And I'm also now trying to share my screen with all participants. Let me see if this works. Oh, yes. Let's stop share. Okay, if I am going to attempt one more time, and if it doesn't work, I'm just gonna go ahead.
Let's see if you
do you see the green?
Yes.
The green arrow at the bottom of your screen. If you press that, you should be able to select just your PowerPoint or your whole screen.
Right. So I've
and then press share at the bottom of that window and it'll pop up for us.
Right. I'm clicking on what I want to share, but that's not happening.
There's a button at the bottom of that window that says share, and that confirms the share.
Yeah, I did. I clicked that. It's asking me to open system preferences.
Okay.
Halimah, I'll grab your presentation off of our drive and just go ahead and start, and then I will bring it up for you.
Great, thank you very much. Thank you very much. And I just wanted to thank Andrea and the organizers and Tami for that, your beginning, because there's so many points of overlap in what we will discuss inevitably so. And I sort of wanted to begin by situating my approach to questions of gender, race, class, and development within that history of socio-political relations Tami referred to in the Caribbean. And by Caribbean, I largely work out of the English-speaking Caribbean and will make some brief references to the wider Caribbean. And maybe to begin by saying, as well as in the Caribbean, in Central, South, and North America, societies, of course, with a history of settler colonialism, race largely overdetermines the organization of social, political, and economic relations, including the emergence of development as a global ideology. And if you could go forward for me, please. I'm not sure if I can, now that I'm not sharing the screen. Thanks. So I wanted to start with this quotation by Sylvia Wynter, who says that all our present struggles with respect to race, class, gender, sexual orientation, ethnicity, struggles over the environment, global warming, severe climate change, the sharply unequal distribution of the Earth's resources, that these are all differing facets of the central ethno-class man versus human struggle. And by that, what she really means is that overdetermining and underpinning much of social relations emerging out of that settler colonialism experience is the dominance of Euro, Anglo-American elite white man. and him as an archetype of what it means to be human. And that race sort of coalesces around that idea and underpins the organization of society. So that race as a relation of power emerged alongside European settled colonialism and served to justify attempts at native genocide, mass enslavement of Africans, as well as the exploitations of persons of East Indian descent under the indentureship system. Race then animates and overdetermines gender and class relations in the region, and that this model of colonial development emerged under conditions that promoted the most egregious forms of labor exploitation of indigenous African and Indo-Caribbean people. For example, under British chattel slavery, enslaved Africans were legally codified as property, with enslaved Black women exploited as suppliers and producers of labor, enduring multiple forms of sexual, gendered, and racist violence. And let us be clear that the perennial problem of gendered violence, gender-based violence against women, girls, and persons who do not experience gender as binary cannot be separated from the structural violence of colonialism and imperialism. And this largely central theme in my work, kind of analyzing violence and histories of violence in the Middle East region as sort of interconnected. And that when I talk about and analyze gender-based violence, I'm really looking to situate that within larger histories of violence in the region. Next slide. So like that inspired by the work of Sylvia Winter, Xerxes Mendes writes, and I quote, she writes, without a history, and you could go to the next slide, without a history, without an understanding of how gender comes to be racialized through such colonial relationships of power, we end up with a category of analysis that obscures as much as it claims to reveal. For instance, while gender reveals the ways in which free women were subordinated in relation to free men, it obscures the ways in which those same free women were partially empowered in relation to enslaved males, females, and everything in between. And end of quote. So that this partially is the backdrop against which I want to briefly turn to questions of development ideology, and their race, gender, and class implications. And I do apologize for the overlap between the heading of my slides and the text beneath it. It looks fine on my screen, but it's just showing that way on yours, so apologies for that. So I sort of want to look at Caribbean economies and how they're characterized. And, you know, several persons analyzing Caribbean economies have remarked that we have small, open, highly economies that are highly vulnerable to external shocks. The making of the Caribbean under European colonialism was for the explicit purpose of imperial expansion, so that while the majority of laboring classes language, European cities and European elites were enriched. The next slide. As a model of colonial economic development in which colonies in the region were created to export unprocessed and semi-processed commodities and to import manufactured goods at a higher cost, they and others observe that the Caribbean produces what it does not consume and consumes what it does not produce. Next slide. So that through, so the political economy of the Caribbean then emerges with the following within the following set of arrangements. Our commodities, we have one or two commodities accounting for at least 3/4 of exports in most countries. So in the early period of colonization, we are talking about sugar in places like Barbados. We are talking about later on, up until the 1990s in the Eastern Caribbean, the banana was the single crop that accounted for most of the GDP of countries in the Eastern Caribbean. We have bauxite in Jamaica, in other parts of the Caribbean. We have a situation of extreme trade dependency. So trade accounts for, could you go to the next slide, please? Trade accounts for a large portion of national income, well over 50% in most cases. For more than a century following the formal end of slavery in the British Caribbean, the region endured the structural violence of neglect under several colonial administrations. So the lack of adequate social services, ongoing labor movement, and a general unwillingness of populations to accept poor living conditions culminated in a series of labor uprisings in the 1930s, historian Richard Boland makes the point that for over 100 years since the end of slavery, the economic situation for Africans remained virtually unchanged. We had the Moyne Commission report of 1945, which reported on the poor living conditions, and that as a sort of framing for the uprisings of the 1930s. We begin to see a shift in the global political economy and the geopolitics of the region in the immediate post-World War II period. So Ilia Rodriguez, she argues that this period, and she's talking about the 50s, 60s onwards, development emerged as a global ideology rooted in the ideal of progress through industrialization, promoted through the application of Western science and technology. And this is very much so sort of what Tami referred to when she was talking about industrialization by invitation, and Puerto Rico's Operation Bootstrap being the most sort of extreme example of how that functioned in the region. But the immediate effects was sort of the decimation of the agricultural production in the region. And women's labor, in the exploitation of women's labor in not just the productive sector, but in terms of reproducing, in terms of reproduction, social reproduction. Women were to be inserted in this process of development with little regard for gender, race, and class inequalities inherent in this model. Right. And so when Tami talks again about neoliberal economics, which is what we see emerging in the 60s, well, in the 80s onwards, premised on this philosophy of privatization, trade liberalization, deregulation, state divestment of social services, and measures by the state to sort of generate wealth premised on these assumptions. And this has sort of dominated not only Caribbean, but a number of economies in the developing world. Outside of the Cuba and the Cuban Revolution, the Grenadine Revolution that experimented with a different form of sort of social organization, and Manley's, in Jamaica, Manley's attempt at democratic socialism, what we have is a predominance of neoliberal ideology sort of guided economic and social development in the region. But what this means is that if that sort of much of the wealth generated ends up in the hands of a small group of elites and transnational corporations. It is it is the basis of the structural adjustment policies of the 1960s, 70s and 80s to which Tami referred. And the early 1990s, we saw record levels of, in this period, we saw record levels of unemployment, with women more acutely affected, and increased levels of violence against women during that period of structural adjustment. We see as well in the 1990s, an earlier period for sugar, but later for the banana industry in the Eastern Caribbean, a removal of preferential treatment, which would have been very essential in the agricultural industry in the region. Although it was monocrop, the removal of preferential treatment meant that we had to trade on the open market under this guise of trade liberalization. But what that really meant was it's further eroded the inequalities that already existed in the global trade relations for the region. So if I can move to the next slide, I wanted to sort of end with a word on COVID, and to say that, you know, it goes without saying the pandemic has upended Caribbean economies and global economies. And we are witness to the fundamental ways in which it has widened social cleavages and increased insecurity. Such changes continue to unfold in uneven and specific ways across and within countries and in the region, as well as other regions across the world. In every region of the world, women and girls are more acutely affected by the pandemic. We see that gender, race, class, and geographic inequalities between and among women and men have deepened, and this situation is worse for Black and Indigenous women, women within religious minorities, women under the threat of violence in their homes, and women who were far more likely to be in positions of precarious employment prior to the pandemic. We are witnessing increased food insecurity, devastation to our tourism-based economies, sharp rising of unemployment, and an equally sharp increase in women's care work. So globally, there is an overrepresentation of racialized and the poor in deaths to coronavirus. And so in my final slide, I'm making the point here that, you know, the brief analysis is meant to expose a set of enduring, uneven and interconnected relations of power, which function in ways to undermine the lives of the majority, including large groups of women and girls. So the question for us then becomes, how do we guarantee a kind of social transformation away from the current set of extractive and exploitative arrangements regionally and globally? And I'll stop there for now. Thank you very much.
Yes, yeah, all of that. Thank you both for this presentation, for your presentations. I want to open up, I'm going to combine the discussion with the question and answer from the audience because we're coming up closer to time. But I want to talk a little bit about Halimah, you talked about the overrepresentation of man, of the human, of man as human, the Euro-American man as human. And Tami, in your presentation, something that stuck out to me was the comment that I wrote down with an exclamation that this overrepresentation of the Western and meddling in Caribbean can be summed up in, let's try something new out there. And so all of this reminds me of the documentary Life and Debt as well, and my own, and it connects to my own work on Caribbean women's migration. And so I want to talk about that a little bit, and I want to include a question from Kimberly, who asked, and I'm coming to the question. The question is basically around the issue of what you're talking about, marginalization and invisibilization of women's labor, right? And so I'm thinking about, for instance, as we're looking to create things new to be competitive in this global system, I'm thinking about one of the questions I was going to ask around the blue economy. I'm thinking about that regarding the new government in Barbados are really, really focusing on moving forward in this industry called the blue economy. And how does all of these trying to overcome this, being a part of this global trading system that has really crippled the Caribbean in many ways, how are women in terms of all of their intersection? And Kimberly's question is about older women. How are older women being invisibilized simultaneously in all of these new ways that the Caribbean is trying to compete? I know that's a long question.
Halimah, you know more about the Barbados context. Do you want to speak to the blue economy question? And then maybe I can go from there.
And it's not necessarily I'm just using the blue economy as an example. Yeah, because I'm thinking my people are fisher folk. And so that question becomes really interesting for me. Like, how are the women's labor in fishing and all that going to be and these are older women, right? How are they going to be invisibilized and marginalized in the new iterations of the global colonial nexus?
Yeah, thanks so much for those questions, the provocations you raised, Andrea, as well as Kimberly's question. And I think it's essential. I want to answer it in two ways. One, by talking about a project that the University of the West Indies, through CERMES, the Center for Environmental Resource Management, is conducting called GIFT, Gender in Fisheries. Gender in Fisheries, I think, in the Caribbean is the wider title. And that project specifically traces the experiences of women fisher folk. And Kimberly is right, and you're right too, Andrea, including a number of older women fisher folk. And why that becomes so important, because like other spaces in the economy, women seem to dominate, or they are mostly occupying positions of, you know, traders in fisheries, sorry. Whereas much of that labor in terms of the actual fishing takes place among men, and what those divisions mean and what they throw up. I talk about this because oftentimes when we hear engagement on the so-called blue economy, it is far removed from the experience of people actually doing that work. So the people who are talking about the blue economy are the political elites, are by and large persons who run larger sort of packaging and housing industry. So women are paying those spaces, but as packers of goods to be exported in fisheries. but we're not seeing enough women engaged in actually planning the arrangements that are supposed to mostly affect them. So I think what that project is seeking to do, and very usefully so, is engaging women who are at various stages at various levels of in that sort of industry. My fear is exactly what Tami is arguing. Is that these relations appear to fall back onto themselves in ways that are very reminiscent of a history of relations where women's labor is seen as sort of supplementary for the household, which is extremely a distortion of the Caribbean experiences, because we have a significantly high number of households headed by women. The unfortunate reality is that those households are the most economically depressed households, and that many of those households are run by older women, grandmothers, aunts, and so on. And so we have to reckon with how women's labor isn't appropriately monetized and isn't appropriately valued. And it is reproducing itself in various other spaces, including in fisheries. Yeah. So that's the kind of answer I have for now. So we do have to unpick those conversations and talk about a different kind of justice if we are thinking about imagine, seeing a new future for the region.
Right. And Tami, I wanted to jump in.
Can I tag in on that? Yeah, no, I think it's a really important question. And, as I often do, I see it in both the sort of historical lens and contemporary lens. So to Halimah's point, so much of any kind of development initiative that we can think about existing today or even going forward, as people are continuing to think about the continually depressed economies made much worse by COVID. And I hope we can talk about that, the over dependence on tourism. But before we can think about anything next, I really think we have to think about what underpins these thought processes, right? So Halimah was talking about the centrality of the human, Winter's notion of humanity, and it made me instantly think about Spiller's work on ungendering, right? How you layer the racialization on top of the gendering. And so this leaves the Black woman particularly vulnerable, right? Who is she? What is she? She's without her verb, right? So we're neither gendered nor racialized appropriately. So extremely vulnerable to economic processes and initiatives, right? So that is a sort of old, but also in the new, this neoliberal, the sort of core, for me, the crux of my objection to this neoliberalism shift of development is its focus on the individual, right? It's the person who can get the job, who can market their individual skills, never mind the household, right? So it really is sort of over and against any kind of community uplift or benefit or kind of unionization or collective action, right? Which so much of Caribbean historical movement has come out of, right? It's a sort of collective, both revolution and unionizing, but it's against that. It's sort of who can go in and who can maximize their human capital to earn a paycheck, right? And so what the question about older women, it's the invisibilization of an entire community and kinship network. So no one cares who's watching the children. No one cares how the bills get paid, how the electric bills, it's can you show up? Can you put on, the costume? Can you perform the role of whatever it is this industry is requiring you to do and then go home and pretend to do it again, right? So yes, older women's labor, of course, is invisibilized at the same time that they're asked and expected to do more because there's always more labor, particularly in COVID. And yeah, Halimah, when you raise it at the end of your slide, I really would like to dwell on that because we do see the increase in labor and again, at the same time, the erasure of that labor from the public discourse of what has happened to us. So yeah, I think it is the sort of ungendering and the particular vulnerability of Black women that has come about through historical processes. But I also think that is exacerbated by this sort of neoliberal emphasis on you as an individual who contains this kind of human capital that must be maximized. All this language that, if you engage with this for any length of time will strike you as strange if you think about how are these people actually living their lives? As an anthropologist, I think about what are the life ways, right? So when you leave your house, what has to happen in order for you to purchase that outfit that is required to perform this role, right? What is required for you to be able to leave your children doing remote work? Do you have stable electricity for the Zoom? That there are all kinds of qualitative, quantitative, there's a package of things that makes people's lives possible. And so much of this gets erased, right? And so maybe that's extended family networks of living with grandparents, but just that we neglect so much of the lived reality of people's lives when we try to sort of theorize and politicize development policies.
Yes. I totally agree with everything that you've said. And Tami, you talked about Spiller's work, and I'm thinking about how she theorizes the hieroglyphics of the flesh. Particularly know that we're not using, we're not saying flesh, we're not calling people flesh, but we're actually now calling them assets. And I've seen that, especially at Virginia Tech, where we're talking about human beings and we're referring them to them as assets. And so I want to pull on two questions, one from Carolyn and Maggie, and combine those together. And they're asking, not Maggie, Nicole and Maggie, and they're asking about the conditions under which women and girls, and this is a question particular to you, Tami, but I also want to extend it to Halimah, because Halimah's work is also on gender-based violence, right? And so the questions are about what are the conditions that these women and girls are working under in the EDCs? How are they being treated? Is there any increase in violence in the workplace? Yeah, and so and Halimah, in your own work, how is this violence not only in the workplace, but how is this neoliberal capitalist understanding of how we are going to try something new there also translating in the larger community and violence against women and girls?
Thank you for the question. And it gives me an opportunity to flesh out a bit the EDC work. Yeah, so actually in my ethnographic work, there isn't a rise so much on person-to-person violence or abuse between, for instance, supervisors and their subordinates, right? That these, and it also bears mentioning, as with the pink collar economy that I mentioned in the Barbados context, within, relatively speaking, I have to say that these women are not becoming millionaires, but relatively speaking, these are well-paying positions. In many ways, they're desirable jobs because they're air-conditioned offices, they're answering telephones, right? They have the kind of proximity to wealth. They themselves don't become wealthy, but they have the kind of inclusion in this sector that is, in some ways of speaking, desirable, right? But there isn't the kind of person-to-person violence. However, I do argue that there is a whole host of structural violences that, again, you have to sort of analyze and theorize to make them visible, right? So first of all, the whole history that I talked about with how do particular workers become desirable, right? Why is it this community of young women that become EDC girls? What are their educational backgrounds? What kinds of erasures need to happen around things like a local accent? What kind of family names do people have to have, right? There's a set of structural violences rooted in from the moment of plantation agriculture, from slavery, right? These kinds of hierarchies that benefit people that benefit women in particular with lighter skin tone, right? So we see the division of indoor work versus outdoor plantation work that then become multiplied with newer and newer opportunities, right? So again, I want to be careful that I'm not saying, oh, this neoliberal development is the same as slavery, but there are kinds of hierarchies that began, right, that are foundational, that incrementally multiply, right? So did you go to the right school? Do you speak the right way? Do you know the right people? Is your network, and what is that question? And so when I interviewed people in the sector and I said, how do you, it seems strange that so many of these people have a very similar background and network. And to their mind, and honestly so, a lot of the hiring managers would say, well, we just hire the best candidate. And so my work is just trying to uncover what is the kind of history that absents, that when you say the best candidate, what kind of history is absented from that, right? What are you sort of not seeing and not understanding? So there is structural violence there, but there is also the kind of structural violence of their position. So one sees what young women gain employment in this sector, they're subject to increased policing around things like respectability politics, so their behavior is monitored in really intense ways by both their employers, right? So they're meant to behave. For those of us that are familiar with respectability, the discourse of respectability politics, they're supposed to be the sort of proper face of the program. So that affects how they spend their time. There's also the violence of their sort of spending, their consumption patterns being attempted to be controlled by the local community. So folks feel that they should spend their money in particular ways. So they're in this kind of bind. These young women find themselves in the bind of being expected to provide for their local community because, hey, you have this great paying job now and we don't have access to it. But at the same time, their behavior is policed by this kind of respectability politics that has really been a source of extreme violence for Black women for centuries in the region.
Mm-hmm.
So Andrea, and thanks for that, Tami. And I kind of wanted to pick up the notion of assets in a slightly different way for thinking about violence, really underlining all that Tami said around the relationship between structural violence and these other kind of interpersonal experiences that her research with EDC girls sort of reveals. And I wanted to think about assets in a particular way because in looking at gender-based violence and in talking about, you know, the sort of gendered violence of sexual harassment in the, what might be coded as sexual harassment in the workplace, intimate partner violence, and so on. What I'm seeing sometimes is a talk around it that is very much so sort of drawing on a kind of neoliberal grammar. And I say that because in sort of doing violence response work, some of the justification for why, you know, research needs to be done or governments need to have robust response is a kind of instrumentalization of women. So we cannot be having violence against women because they won't be productive workers if they can't get to work. So there's a way in which in service of the economy, in service of progress, rather than starting from the place of individual autonomy and that people should live a life free of violence because, you know, that should be part of our shared humanity. It becomes, well, you know, when women are attacked, this is the cost to the economy. And I think that's a really dangerous kind of instrumentalization of women that sort of removes your bodily integrity and your sense of self, even as I am not, and I want to be careful about not eschewing any notions of the importance of community. But when it comes that we kind of do violence and prevention work or violence response work or research in service of the economy, then it misses the point about, you know, ensuring that we engage in removing violence as something that we need to do as part of our human responsibility. And I use human very loosely there because, again, I want to be very clear that notwithstanding the dominance of a human rights discourse globally, there still is a serious question about who gets to occupy that category of the human. And we have not reckoned appropriately with that. It explains what we are seeing in the US in terms of racial violence. It explains what we see in terms of the sort of re-emerging of reassertion of certain kind of imperial and colonial relations of power. So I'm using, I want to be very clear when I talk about the human that we still have to reckon with who gets to occupy that category. And it's a very, it centers questions of race. But I wanted to say that because I am very wary of this emerging way of thinking about responding to violence against women that instrumentalizes women's lives.
Mm-hmm. I mean, we have so much to talk about, but we are coming up on time. And so what I want to do really quick is I want to open it up to you two to basically give us any last comments that you really wanted to talk about that we haven't been able to discuss in this panel. I mean, always not enough time, man.
No, I agree. I'm just going to jump in because I know we're trying to close, but I just wanted to have the opportunity to talk with Halimah even briefly about how you ended the formal portion of your presentation and the sort of labor that we have seen in COVID. So in my context, right, so the centrality of colonialism is key, the fact that we're in American territory. And so much of the Caribbean, these island nations were forced to close their borders, right, but also had the capacity to close their borders to travel, whereas the USVI did not, right, as a territory of the United States. So there was a moment in which there were all these headlines that really sensationalized, but the highest, the hottest hotspot for COVID in America is the USVI, which was really frustrating when that kind of spike comes exactly because we were unable to close borders and flights from the US were continuing to come in at unprecedented pace because everything else was closed, right? And people wanted to get out of the mainland. So we see that, but we also see the kind of rise in women's labor with remote schooling and managing kinship networks. So I just wanted to hear more about your sort of thoughts around how COVID has magnified some of the things that you and I work on, often in a different lens.
And I want to respond to you and respond to what I saw Kimberly put in the chat about how do we, going back to that question posed at the end. So we're having all these conversations about COVID and mitigation measures, the effects of lockdown. And we are not, I think, reckoning with the reality of women occupying, in many regards, the front line of COVID response, and sort of being the ones largely responsible for dealing with the increased care work that has come with that, and women being very absent in a large degree from questions of leadership and mitigation to COVID. So we are occupying the front lines and putting literally our bodies in places, being exposed to contracting it. So how many healthcare workers have died and so on. But we are not as involved as we should be in reimagining and seeing what our societies ought to be looking like now and in a future beyond COVID, or beyond the worst effects of COVID. So for me, I go to the spaces where women are organizing and are offering alternative visions of the future. So Caribbean civil society women's organizations doing work in communities and doing very transformative and radical work that never gets into the space of, you know, all sorts of like development agency work and so on into the mainstream with governments. And I think here are the spaces we're going to find the answer. So the question I pose at the end, how do we transform our societies? I think there's a question on the table for the Caribbean as well as other parts of the world, questions of reparatory justice, and actually taking up those questions in very serious ways. And sometimes when you bring the question of reparation or reparatory justice to the table, there's this notion, I think, from large nations that you're asking for a handout. But no, all we're asking for is for you to return the wealth that was extracted in the first place. And I'm not saying, and whatever that looks like, we have to have a coming together to ask questions about reparation, but it must be a coming together that includes Indigenous people, that includes women from across various levels, racialized differently. It must include gender, binary and non-binary individuals. We have to have a serious conversation that is not a conversation about diversity, but is a conversation about justice. Yeah. And I really want for us to take up that and ask ourselves serious questions that we need to check our privilege, however, whatever that looks like, in having those questions about justice. And I'll stop there.
Yeah. Yes, thank you very much. We are at time. And you will not, this is not the last you'll be hearing from these brilliant women. Stay tuned, Virginia Tech community, because there's so much more that we need to talk about. I want to extend just a heartfelt thank you to Halimah and to Tami for doing this panel this morning. Thank you so much.
Very, very lovely. Great moderating, great questions. And remember that you can message the speakers through the attendees tab and the exhibitors tab in Whova if you would like to ask them questions directly. And we have a community forum dedicated to this topic. So thank you everybody so much. And I pasted a link back to plenary here in the chat window for you. And we will reconvene at 11:40. Thank you for a fantastic talk.
Thank you.